I'm going to talk mostly about, I think, some of the political implications of the Syriza victory and also what it means particularly for us here in the UK, because although a lot of the things about the context here are very different, I think there's some clear lessons that we can learn. And I went over to Greece, and that's where I met Kostas, and while I was there, I was very much reminded of a joke which has been doing the rounds on the left a bit over the last couple of years, which is that Ralph Miliband, who was one of the great left-wing theorists of the 20th century in Britain, famously argued that you couldn't achieve social change through the Labour Party, and then kindly produced two sons to prove it. And what Ralph Miliband argued for instead of the Labour Party was what he called a party of the movement, a party that's tied into much more energetic and fast-moving and fleet-of-foot social movements able to adapt to the circumstances and changing politics of the day. And that, I think, is, to at least a significant extent, what we have seen both in Greece with the rise of Syriza and possibly even more in Spain with the rise of Podemos. And I think that there's a significant extent to which it's what we've seen in the UK with the rise of Greens both here and in Scotland. And we had Natalie earlier, explicitly talking about Occupy democracy, about, the coalition against austerity and so on. It's not often that historically we've had parties willing to talk about such radical social movements quite so openly and to be so enthusiastic about being tied into them. And I think that's a very important lesson that we can learn from Syriza, that it's possible to be that kind of party and to achieve power. In fact, I think the only way that you can achieve power and you can maintain your radicalness, you can do the thing which you were set up to do, is if you continue to be tied into the social movements which will hold you to account. That's the same lesson as we've learned in Latin America. It's the same lesson as we've learned throughout history, and I think it's an absolutely vital lesson for us. We've always said in the Greens that we ought to be a party of the social movements. I think that that is, to an extent at least, what Syriza is, it's what Podemos is, and it's what we must continue to strive to be, at least. And I think when we're thinking about what we mean by staying radical, it's important not just to think about austerity, because, of course, Syriza is a government with a whole comprehensive programme. And for me, the most remarkable thing about them is their utter unwillingness to engage in any of the migrant bashing, which it's always tempting for politicians to get into. And you have the Labour Party in the UK saying that they can't possibly ever be successful electorally unless they're willing to turn on people from other countries and blame them for the problems that we all face. And yet, Britain doesn't have a problem with migration. Greece is the first country that most, or a huge number of the refugees arriving from Africa and the Middle East land in. They have really significant questions about how to deal with migration, and yet you've got a government in Greece that was elected while absolutely refusing to pander to any of that migrant scapegoating. I think that's a very, very important lesson for us. We have to remember that. And we can look down their broader policy proposals. So, for example, they're in favour of decriminalising all drugs, which, of course, we are too, and in fact 40% of the British population is too. And I don't give that as an example because it's the most important thing, but because all of these policies which journalists in the UK throw at us and tell us, could never ever be elected, totally absurd, and so on. A lot of these are policies that have just got a government elected in a European country, and it's important. This isn't just about austerity. This was a broad, radical, progressive programme. And I agree with the concerns about environmental questions, but it's important for us to look those journalists in the eye and say, no, these aren't totally crazy ideas. These are perfectly sensible ideas, and there have been governments elected in Europe on a very similar manifesto to our own. And in that context also, as Kostas was telling us, that I think it's important that we stay radical because otherwise our environmentalism gets pulled off into that sort of world middle-class luxury. And it's important we never let that happen, because as soon as an economic crisis hits, and if we become the party that tells you to change your light bulbs, and that blames you for not doing your recycling, then of course, as soon as an economic crisis hits, people stop doing that. So, it's absolutely vital that we learn that lesson, that environmentalism is tied into a broader struggle against neoliberalism, against patriarchy, against the oppressive structures in the world today. It's not something separate from it. And it's very easy for Greens. I remember being in the party in 2009, and we'd always be dragged into that by everyone else. Journalists would say to us, don't you do your own recycling? Why do you fly anywhere? And it always encouraged to get dragged into that sort of personal lifestylist kind of middle-class environmentalism debate. And of course, it's absolutely vital we learn that lesson from Greece, that that road leads nowhere. And the final thing I want to say, we can't come to questions, is it's important that we face up to a quite uncomfortable reality for us on the left in Britain about what Greece tells us about the EU, which is that, I will vote to stay in the European Union because I think the returning of powers to Westminster doesn't bring me any sense of hope at all. But we also need to be clear that the European Union that we are in is utterly disastrous. And it is, the Syriza government has only been able to do a certain amount. They are continuing to have significant austerity imposed on the people of Greece. There is an HIV epidemic in Greece, and there are people genuinely starving, and the European Union is still forcing them through grinding austerity. And this is not a healthy political institution which we should be proud to defend. This is an institution which urgently needs radical reform. And the most exciting thing potentially for us in terms of our lives about the Syriza government is it's a chance to really push with allies. They want to be in the EU, they want to change the EU. And if anyone is going to be able to bring that message to one of the biggest members of the EU, the UK, then it's us. And we're going to have a really important job to do in working out, particularly if there is a European referendum, how we're going to make that case in Britain for, yes, staying in, but for not having the kind of EU which imposes grinding poverty on people across Europe, but rather the kind of EU which we'd all like, which stands up to the powers of global corporations, which gets rid of neoliberalism rather than entrenching it. And that's our task, I think, with our Syriza and our Green friends in Greece. And it's going to be a big challenge, but it's going to be fun.